You're listening to CoachingCues podcast, where experts all around the world answer your most burning questions surrounding the wide topic of strength training. Every week we tackle the what, the why, and the how of one specific topic in just 15 minutes. Straight to the point, no fluff. So, without further ado, let's get straight into this week's episode.
Hey guys, Martin Refalo here. Thanks for tuning in to the CoachingCues podcast. It truly is a privilege to have this opportunity to distribute knowledge on a topic I am highly passionate about. And if you haven't already, be sure to follow CoachingCues on Instagram to stay up to date with all future podcasts. I am the education manager at JPS Health and Fitness, which is a coaching and education company from Melbourne, Australia. And I am also a Ph.D. student at Deakin University, currently investigating the influence of proximity to failure on skeletal muscle hypertrophy in resistance training. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to collaborate with some fellow researchers on a systematic review and meta-analysis titled Influence of Resistance Training Load on Measures of Skeletal Muscle Hypertrophy and Improvements in Maximal Strength and Neuromuscular Task Performance. So today, I'm going to give you guys an overview of the findings and also provide some practical applications to better inform your load selection as it pertains to muscle hypertrophy and muscular strength related goals. Now, the reason I undertook this research was to update previous research on this topic, specifically a 2017 meta-analysis by Schoenfeld and colleagues, and also to simply add more evidence to the literature body surrounding the influence of load on physiological adaptations. And this is important, as many notions surrounding this topic are ill-informed, particularly due to the widespread understanding of the strength hypertrophy endurance continuum. And you may have learned about this continuum in the past, or you may have read about it in old exercise science textbooks. And essentially, it confines physiological adaptations to specific rep and loading ranges. For example, the adaptation of strength is usually confined to 1 to 6 reps. Muscle hypertrophy, 8 to 12 reps. If you're wondering what happened to the 7th rep, nobody knows, and it's not existent in this continuum. And muscular endurance beyond that 15 rep mark. And the findings of my research and previous research on this topic are in slight conflict with the suppositions of this continuum. So for example, when meta-analyzing the results of 20 studies investigating changes in whole muscle size, which includes measures like muscle thickness, muscle cross-sectional area, fiber cross-sectional area, and even lean body mass, we found that there was no difference between high and low load resistance training on muscle hypertrophy. Now, you may ask, well, what was considered a high and a low load? In the context of our research, a high load was considered as greater than 60% of 1RM, and a low load was considered as equal to or less than 60% of 1RM. Now, of course, in practice, a high and a low load may be defined differently, but that was the case in our research. So, muscle hypertrophy seems to some extent to be a load-independent adaptation. But there is some reason to believe that extremely low loads, let's say under 30% of 1RM, may be disadvantageous or at least simply too inefficient when trying to maximize muscle hypertrophy. Now, these findings, which clearly show that muscle hypertrophy can be achieved well outside the 8 to 12 rep range, highlight that proximity to failure coupled with an adequate volume rather than load per se are the key variables for inducing sufficient mechanical tension that promotes muscle hypertrophy. So essentially, when selecting a load, what you need to do is provide yourself with the best opportunity possible to reach a sufficient proximity to failure within a given set, whilst maintaining adequate technique that directs mechanical tension to the target musculature. And of course, load can influence your ability to maintain technique. And also, we need to ensure that the set itself is not terminated purely due to subjective feelings of discomfort. Now, these feelings of discomfort that we tend to feel during resistance training are not actually associated with any of our desired physiological adaptations and can interfere with our ability to estimate proximity to failure and thus maximize the muscle hypertrophic stimulus we achieve in a given set. And research shows that specifically low load, high rep sets induce greater levels of discomfort than higher load, low rep sets, likely due to the peripheral fatigue and metabolic stress that is highly associated with prolonged sets. And this is a crucial piece of information that has many programming applications. So for example, programming low load, high rep sets for a beginner who is not well versed with RIR or RP prediction may be doing them a disservice, considering the chances of them confusing their perceptions of effort with their perceptions of discomfort is high. The chances of them overestimating the proximity to failure is also high. So low loads may increase your chances of terminating a set further from momentary muscular failure than you actually desire. Also, we have evidence to support that proximity to failure may be more important for low load sets versus high load sets. And this is because with the high load, we are by default starting our sets closer to momentary muscular failure. And thus, muscle fibers are likely sufficiently stimulated to hypertrophy further from failure with a high load versus a low load. However, we do need more research in this area to further elucidate the interaction between load and proximity to failure. So to summarize, when aiming to maximize muscle hypertrophy, I advise selecting a load that does not limit safe exercise execution and is dependent on the exercise chosen itself, with some exercises simply lending themselves better to low loads versus high loads. A simple example of this may be a dumbbell lateral raise, which seems to be suited more towards the low load, higher repetition range. If we think about a barbell squat though, the opposite may be true. Now, we also need to choose a load that allows for a close proximity to failure to be achieved whilst limiting interference of discomfort or perceptions of discomfort. If we think about performing a barbell squat with a very high number of repetitions, we can imagine the feelings of discomfort that would manifest towards the end of a set. We also know our cardiovascular and respiratory systems would be working in overdrive, and all those factors can influence our ability to accurately gauge proximity to failure and terminate our sets at a sufficient point to maximize that muscle hypertrophic stimulus. I also think that loads can be simply based on your individual preference, and by no means do you have to confine yourself to the 8 to 12 rep range when muscle hypertrophy is the goal. Now, if we turn our attention to muscular strength, upon meta-analyzing 36 studies that investigated dynamic one-arm strength, we found an advantage for high loads versus low loads. And this is to be expected and definitely in line with previous research. Now, before I dive into the findings, I just want to provide a basis for muscular strength. Okay, strength itself is a product of many physiological adaptations to resistance training and also has a psychological component too. So for example, neural adaptations are the main drivers of increased force production. And force production itself is essentially what characterizes strength in resistance training. However, morphological adaptations like muscle hypertrophy and contractile characteristics of a muscle may also contribute to strength. And arousal, for example, can modulate your ability to express force, highlighting the psychological component to strength. And what is also useful to understand when interpreting the results of this analysis and any research is that strength is highly specific. For example, It's specific to the load or rep range you wish to get stronger at, and specific to the exercise you wish to get stronger at, and many other factors too. For the rest of this discussion, we're going to consider strength as measured by dynamic 1RM, right? So 1RM is a common measure of strength used in practice. Of course, to get stronger at a 1RM, high loads that are specific to that 1RM need to be used. It's exposure to these high loads that induces the neural adaptations required to express maximal amounts of force in the specific exercise we want to get stronger at. And this, of course, has practical benefits too. Simply lifting the high loads and feeling what it's like to lift them and learning how to grind through really hard reps, it can be highly beneficial. Now, although lifting high loads on the exercise you want to get stronger at is the key stimulus for strength and is necessary at some point in your training program, low loads also have some utility. So although training with low loads may not maximize immediate neural adaptations, they essentially provide the perfect opportunity to work on other components of strength, specifically technique practice, which may have delayed and a more cumulative impact on strength. We know lifting a load with efficient technique is crucial for strength, and you can really only learn how to do this, at least to the best degree possible, with a lower load. We can also implement tempos with a lower load, which can speed up technique acquisition, and intending to move the load as fast as possible to maximize power output is also likely an important consideration. So to summarize here, high loads are advantageous for neural adaptations that lead directly to enhanced strength, while there are elements of specificity, like I mentioned, exercise specificity and rep or loading range specificity, that need to be considered during program design and really should inform your load selection. Okay, if you want to get stronger at a 1RM, your training is going to look a little different to you wanting to get stronger at maybe a 5 or an 8RM. And of course, technique practice forms a large component of strength development. So it is possible that greater repetition practice with lower loads may facilitate additional strength gains with resistance training. So incorporating both high and low load training into a strength training program is likely a good idea, with a bias potentially towards the higher loads, but this of course depends on your current level of advancement and exercise competency. So taken as a whole, it is clear that the strength hypertrophy endurance continuum just doesn't paint the clearest picture as to how load influences muscle hypertrophy and muscular strength. Current research shows that a wide spectrum of loads can elicit muscle hypertrophy, and you can use this knowledge to your advantage when programming. And for strength, load is clearly a determining factor, but it really is dependent on your goal because strength is highly specific. So hopefully, guys, that all makes sense. Once again, thanks for tuning into the CoachingCues podcast. And please let me know if you have more questions. Be sure to follow me on Instagram or follow JPS Education for more. And I will see you guys soon.
Thank you for listening to CoachingCues podcast. If you would like your question to be answered by an expert, please head to coachingcues.org/ask. See you next week.